Good afternoon, everyone. Or good morning. Well, thank you very much for joining this session. I think we will start it right off. And let's start a bit with Mitch first. And perhaps he can tell us a little bit about the RIAA.
So for those who don't know, the RIAA is like the ARIA of the United States, only we focus on representing the major music labels. So in the US, we have split organizations. Our award show, the Grammys, is run by an academy. Our performing rights organization for artists and labels is run by Mike at Sound Exchange, and I represent the major labels. We have another association that represents the independent labels. So instead of having one organization that represents everybody, we have 4 different organizations that represent different parts, which requires us to work together very, very carefully. And as the world becomes a little bit smaller, it's going to force more and more coordination. But the major record labels, Sony, Warner, and Universal in the US, because they're headquartered in the US, and the US is the biggest market, have a very active organization. And we focus on everything from content protection and litigation to communications, revenue, industry-wide statistics, lobbying the government for our rights, and everything that you can imagine in between. And we represent the major labels. Is that better? Hello. Can you hear me? Okay. We represent the major labels and the artists who they distribute. And so up here, there was somebody from the Orchard, which is owned by Sony, and they provide artist services to independent labels. So any artist or any label that distributes through a major or that has a service agreement with a major is represented by the RIAA. So when we go out like IFPI and we look for infringements all around the world, our data is for everybody in that sphere who we represent.
Thank you. And Mike, perhaps you can give us some information about Sound Exchange and what it does both in the United States and over here?
Sure. Is mine working better? Okay. Hi, dude. Hello, everybody. Thanks for being here. Thanks, Jenny. So Sound Exchange, a lot of what we do, the core of what we do is work in the U.S. to help, along with Mitch, to help make sure creators are paid fairly and accurately. That covers a whole host of things. The bulk of what we've done for the past 10 years relates to paying digital performance royalties to artists and labels. In the U.S., we have a very robust streaming market. In fact, I think we have a slide here that shows the growth of Sound Exchange. And we pay out every month. We have over 200,000 accounts we pay. We paid out almost $1 billion US with B, $1 billion with a B, US last year. It's a very explosive streaming market in the US. So we're there to help take in, every month we get data from over 3,000 services. Like I said, we have 200,000 accounts. We send out 30,000 payments a month. And we split it 50-50 between the record labels and the performers. Our DNA is half performer and half artist. Our board is half label and half performer. Our board is half label and half performer. So a lot of what we have done to date is helping make that a very efficient market and helping get the money out from payments by companies like SiriusXM, Pandora, a lot of others, iHeartRadio Online. We administer a lot of that. That's what we did for the first 10 years. We've expanded into other things now. We do a lot of advocacy, standing side by side with the RIAA on a lot of issues to protect creators. We fight to make sure that they're paid accurately. We audit a lot of the services. Now and then we'll sue a service or two if they're not paying. We just had a big $150 million settlement last year. So we do a lot to make sure that the money gets out to creators and performers. And then we've gone beyond that now, and we do other things. We help administer some settlements. We help people do data integrity work. We've even gotten a little bit onto the author side of things, delving a little bit into music publishing issues. So we're trying to, just bring efficiency to the system. I talk a lot about removing friction. Anything we can do to remove friction in the system that allows the money to flow better, so that the people that actually make the music or pay for the music, fund the music, the labels and the performers, as much of that as possible should get out to them, because, as you all know, our industry is not the most efficient in how we do licensing and in how we do payments. So kind of a lot of what we seek to do is whatever it takes to make the system work a little bit better.
Well, thank you very much. So now that we know a little bit about both of your organizations, let's talk about the industry. So for both of you, can you tell or share with us what you've noticed in changes in consumption in the last 5 years?
Yeah, so we'll talk about consumption, and then we'll compare it to revenue, because I think it's very interesting and telling to sort of see how people are listening, and then compare that to where the money is coming from, so that we can draw some conclusions. And we'll do it for the U.S. And then also for Asia, so you can sort of compare the difference between the two markets. Music consumption in the U.S., what you're looking at is a comparison chart between 5 years ago in 2014, and then on the right is the first half of 2019. So it's basically a 5-year comparative chart. And if you look on the left, you'll see that if you look at all of the streaming together, which is, webcast, satellite radio, the other really refers to social media, basically. And streaming there refers to on-demand streaming. So if you take all of it together 5 years ago, it was about 45, less than 50% of the market in total, how people listen to music. So it was about half in those forms, half in other forms, if you compare CDs and digital downloads and radio. And look what happened 5 years later. It's a very short amount of time. But now, if you add up all of the streaming listening, it's almost 70% of the market. So you've gone from less than 50% to 70% of the people listening to music via webcast or satellite radio or on-demand streaming or through social media. That's a really big increase. Also look at the difference in broadcast radio. As streaming, on-demand streaming, webcasting, satellite radio services have increased, it's taken market share away from listeners of broadcast radio. We're going to look at revenue in a second, but this is important because in the United States, artists do not get paid for broadcast radio, unlike almost everywhere else in the world. And so the evolution to streaming services has also meant an evolution to more payment for artists from services that are grabbing share from radio, which doesn't pay artists. The other big thing to notice on this listening consumption chart is the increase in what's called other. That's basically social media. Look at the difference. 5 years ago, 5% of their people got their music through social media-like services. Today, 17% in the US get it through social media-like services. So again, this is 5 years. And even though the last 5 years have been, incredibly transformative, if you just think about the trajectory of change in consumption, and you think about the next 5 years or the next 10 years, it is clear where this is going. And we can talk about revenues in the same context. Did you have anything on listening?
Yeah, a couple other things, to follow up on what Mitch noted. This is how we listen is very different than how the money comes in. Everyone here that is in the creative part of the whether you're representing labels, artists, that the revenue you get comes from, varies radically depending on which part of this pie chart it comes into the ecosystem through. As Mitch mentioned, I think the U.S. stands alone in the industrialized world for not paying performers to use the music. In the U.S., it's a $17 billion industry. The U.S. music broadcast industry makes $17 billion, and they pay zero to the performer. In fact, a stat that I often quote, they make more money off the music than the music industry does in the U.S. So that's something to really think about. And I will say that the fact that streaming has grown, not only does it mean the money flowing through there, but I think it's changed a lot of. There's new opportunities that didn't exist before. For instance, legacy music, back catalog music from older genres, or never used to be as big in the sales model that we all followed for 8 decades. It was always built around the front line, the new releases. One of the nice benefits of the explosion of streaming is you're seeing a resurgence of older music or more classic music, because it's about listening, not about the purchase event. So there's not only does more money go through there, but it's starting to impact different parts of the industry than the sales model.
That's a really good point, because consumption also ties in with revenue, because of course now you only get paid when people listen. You don't get paid just if they buy and don't listen. You only get paid if they listen. So it's obviously, and as you'll be talking about at this conference in Asia as well in the US, completely changed the structures of marketing divisions, promotion divisions, all those services that we'll talk about that labels provide now globally and in less of a balkanized way, they're providing in a different way because of the change in listening consumption. So now let's skip and look at revenue. Because if you compare how people listen with how we make money, it's pretty interesting. If you look at 5 years ago, the orange is sort of divided because in the United States, we have a compulsory license for what's called non-interactive streaming, and that all goes through Sound Exchange, as Mike just indicated. And so if you're listening to a webcast or satellite radio, a radio-like non-interactive streaming service, that's done under a compulsory license. But free market licensing exists for on-demand services like Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, etc. And so we've sort of broken them out so you can see the difference in the revenue. And what's so interesting is you've had this grand transformation over 5 years, but if you look at the Sound Exchange revenue, it's remained, pretty much the same as far as its percentage of revenue that's come in. So a very stable source of revenue. It has grown along with the industry to maintain the same impact 5 years later. So that's where sort of consumption ties in with revenue. When you have a Sound Exchange, a very stable impact that grows with the market. Now look at the difference between the on-demand streaming 5 years ago, which comprised 16% of the revenue, and now 65% of the revenue. So 65% of recorded music revenue in the United States now comes from on-demand services. That means basically subscriptions. And what has happened in the United States from a policy perspective, an economic perspective, is that the advertising-based services, like YouTube, have brought in far less revenue per listener than the subscription services have. And so that's affected how people license, it's affected how people move forward, and it's affected the policy debates in the United States as to whether or not an advertising-based model provides enough market-based compensation to a performer to adequately compensate them for the work that they're doing versus a subscription service. And those issues, I think, are going to exist for a long time. If you look at physical downloads, 5 years ago, it was basically 70% of the market, and now it's just completely flipped. So we went from a physical and download world of 70% to a streaming world of 70%. So the money is going with streaming. So listenership with streaming is growing by a wide margin. Revenue with streaming is growing by a super wide margin. And you can tell, at least in the US, and we'll do Asia in a second and compare them, how that impacts behavior, both licensing and otherwise, inside the United States. So now we have a comparison where you can see the impact of revenue in Asia, and if it looks pretty familiar, It should. If this isn't an illustration of the globalization of music and how we get our revenues in different parts of the world, then I don't know what is. If you combine streaming and physical 5 years ago, about 75%, and now streaming is about 70%. It's almost the same as the United States market in how revenues are comprised, which means that we have in the biggest market in the world and in the biggest growing market in the world, the exact same makeup of how you achieve your revenues, which means that streaming and globalization go together because those revenues are what's feeding all of the people who create the music to drive the next 5 years or so. So it's pretty amazing.
And then we have...
I should mark, however, that the Asia chart here you're seeing is ex-Japan. If we included Japan, physical would obviously be much higher. And we didn't want to sort of look at the pattern with Japan as skewing the rest of the Asian market. So you really do have to consider Japan as a special case where physical and downloads, especially physical, is much, much higher. And so I just wanted to point out that this is a pattern. It shows the similarities, but it does not include Japan.
And then we have, let me move forward. We have another slide that shows a lot about, again, country by country, what's happening with streaming. You'll see that this is for 2018 numbers. Streaming continues to be a huge source of revenue across the APAC region. As Mitch mentioned, in Japan, I think streaming's, I think it's only about 13% of revenue in Japan. So 85+% of revenue in Japan is non-streaming, it's physical and other. But you'll see in the rest, in the rest of the slide there, you know, streaming is representing an immense amount of the revenues, and not only is it a large chunk, it's increasing, you know, by double digits in most territories. So it's just another way to look at the same thing that Mitch was talking about. Streaming isn't the future; it's the current, and it's really, really critical to the industry that we maximize the revenue from this, because you know, where listening used to be promotional, you know, you had people listen to drive them to purchase a CD or a piece of vinyl or a cassette or whatever it may be, or even a download. And the listening was all promotional. A lot of, you know, people gave their stuff away for free for listening because it was a sales economy, and you wanted, you know, that was the fuel that drove the revenue. Well, now you can't do that. I mean, you obviously can if you choose, but you're now cannibalizing the very thing that makes up a huge part of the revenue for the industry. The listen is the consuming event. The hitting of the eardrum is the thing we have to monetize the way we used to monetize somebody swiping a credit card at a cash register. So it requires a real shift in how we think about the industry.
Well, thank you. So we've seen a major change in consumption and the need for changes in business models. So can you talk about what are the changing roles of the labels?
Yeah, so globalization has not just hit revenues, obviously. The mixing of the new digital service providers and the new ways of discovering music by global services has obviously changed how labels in the US work, and I think how global labels work around the country. I know Adam and some others will sort of talk to you later about new developing markets, but I think what the record companies have been able to do with the rise of streaming is to basically leverage the resources that they have in different parts of the world to discover artists and introduce them to markets in ways that they never could have been introduced to those markets in the past. And that's not just an artist who has already made it in their country and you're just figuring out, you know, how to bring them to the US, right? That's the Beatles model, where, you know, somebody takes off in the UK and you say, hey, let's, you know, get you on an airplane and get you over to the US and let you tour and let's see if you can take off there. Now, discovering artists, a lot of times from the very beginning, is global. So if you just look at the phenomenon of Lil Nas X in the United States, so you have, you know, TikTok an Asian platform where there's a large US audience. The US audience uses this platform in order to make these snippets. The major labels all license the platform. And Lil Nas X goes viral on that platform. And so Columbia Records signs Lil Nas X from discovering his popularity on an Asian platform. He's now a US artist on a US label, discovered on a platform that was an Asian platform introduced to the US market. So, discovering artists doesn't just have to be your own artist on an Asian platform. It can also be artists who are Asian artists, but because they're so popular on global platforms, you're able to bring them over into the United States. And K-pop is sort of the best example of that. How in the world do you break artists who are a phenomenon in Asia in the United States? And the answer is, well, if they're on the Spotify Global 100 and competitive services are starting to highlight who they are, that brings opportunities to be able to bring them over to the US in a way that you never could have done before. And it's not just happening with Asia, it's happening in the US, in the Latin music market by leaps and bounds. So you have US listeners who may not even speak Spanish, who are listening to Spanish language music on things like the Spotify Global 100, and artists who have broken in Latin America now have an audience inside the United States speaking a different language that they never could have been introduced to before the new streaming services and the new platforms where you can discover artists all around the world from the very beginning. So our labels are looking every day in their A&R departments at all platforms. Doesn't matter if the platform was developed in China, if the platform was developed in the United States, if the platform was developed in Europe or Latin America. If there's an artist that's taking off and there's a chance to bring them into the US market to leverage those resources to make them a truly global star, then they're going to do it. And if you just look at the numbers, I think I put up a slide of BTS when they first went gold.
That's it?
I think this is it. This is a Nielsen slide, which sort of just gives a few statistics on BTS and their TEAs inside the United States after they had been sort of introduced. But one thing that's amazing to me about K-pop, and I'm sure that it will be with other genres as well, is the die-hard fan base that they are creating in the United States is unbelievable. If you go to the next slide, I'm just showing, these are just a few of the responses that were sort of tweeted out or published on social media from BTS and Blackpink getting their first gold record in the United States. And it took a while, but it was all streaming. And so it's very difficult to get a gold record in the United States, especially when you're doing it with numbers of streams pretty much as your only source. And they did it, and I have never seen social media responses at the RIAA more plentiful than when BTS got a gold record. I think I got 150,000 emojis in response to my retweet of BTS going gold and Blackpink going gold. They wouldn't stop. They just kept coming in and kept
Mitch,
coming in.
don't let that go to your head, Mitch. That's not you.
It wasn't about me?
Not you.
But creating this new diehard fan base as Korean-based groups inside the United States is 100% due to the evolution in streaming and the leveraging of different resources to sign them with different distribution deals for the U.S. market.
And obviously when, that's in terms of getting the artists into the U.S., and once they're into the U.S. economy and the U.S. sales market and the streaming market, that then translates out into money back out to the APAC region. You saw earlier, we paid out at Sound Exchange almost $1 billion, and that's just in the non-interactive area. And obviously their participation of Asian acts, Asian artists, Asian labels, because we pay 50-50. We pay half of everything goes to the labels, half goes to the artist. they're obviously participating in a way that they never have before, and they're not just on the Spotify list, but they're a huge part of American culture now. I think I saw Saturday Night Live is a huge show in the U.S. So I don't know if those of you who know what I'm talking about. It's a Saturday night comedy show where they have a lot of acts break there or have a lot of traction. I think they were the first K-pop or Korean act to headline Saturday Night Live. So there's a lot of participation, and then as a result, a lot more money from both us and the labels heads out to Asia as a result of that.
Okay. Well, this is a question that I just thought of, but do you think K-pop or Asian music or the globalization of music is a one-off trend, or do you think it's something that will continue in the future?
I know it's something that will continue in the future, because if you just looked at the comparative numbers between 5 years and how important streaming is, and then you look at how global streaming is, the platforms that are becoming some of the biggest platforms for streaming are in Asia. And so they are going to carry a lot of Asian artists. And when I don't care if it's a US company or, a label in another part of the world, when you see those numbers based on that platform, that's an opportunity to bring that artist to the US market and to use your marketing and promotion resources in the US to expose them to a market that they otherwise never could have been exposed to in the past. And that allows you as a record company to look globally to find artists who you think have a shot at access to the US market and to make money in that market in a way that you never could before. Right. And the same thing applies in the other direction. I think it was a little bit more of a one-way street before, where you would have US artists or British artists, and then you would look for sort of global scale, first on live in a more traditional way, and then later on streaming services. But it's coming the other way now. That didn't happen before. And I think if you look at the trajectory, it's just going to happen more and more.
And I think it's really, I totally agree. It's definitely not a one-off, and it's really no different than really a lot of other industries and kind of the global economy generally, right? With what's happening, not only on the internet, but with the social media platforms, country boundaries don't matter anymore for social media. They don't matter for goods and services. The whole global economy is becoming much more interwoven, and I think music is just, it's a natural product of that trend. And the beauty of it is the ability to reach in and tap into markets or explore markets you never would before, or sometimes even within a given country, For instance, we come across a lot of examples where you have people who, maybe they grew up in Paris and they really had their favorite radio station in Paris, and they moved to another country. Or maybe they grew up in Japan, wherever it may be, and they miss the experience of their childhood. Or now they can probably tap into that online. They can stream radio stations from around the world. They can experiment with different geographies. They can go on different services and just play around and find areas in the world to experiment with that they never could have done before under the old model.
Right. Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about data, because it does seem that in every industry, data has become the liquid gold. So, Mike, can you talk a little bit about recording data and the value of it to SoundExchange?
Sure. This is where everybody starts to get sleepy. No, data is obviously hugely important. Data is king. In the panel before, Dan's panel, they were talking about the importance of data. And it's funny, data was sort of always important, but not as important as it is now. In the old model, the sales model, there were sort of a few different choke points where all the money flowed. And as long as those places knew where the money needs to go, things kind of worked out. But now the industry is much flatter. There are so many places where money is being made off music, so many points of entry, lower barriers to entry. So you have many more people participating in the money flow than used to. And when you're talking about the scale of digital, trillions of listens a minute around the world, data becomes very, very important. And the metadata, which is attached, if you're a record label, if you're a performer, one of the most important things you can do is make sure that if something's out there that you own, that people know you own it, right? There's a lot of places your music may be played. Sometimes you don't even know it because of compulsory license systems around the world. And to have the data be accurate is what making the data accurate is what makes the money flow accurate. And if the money flow doesn't flow accurately, then we don't have an industry. It's great to have hobbyists and everything, but if you want a thriving industry, the money needs to flow to the proper parts of the creative chain. So one of the things at Sound Exchange we're doing is really pushing to try to make data work better. One of the things we're doing, for instance, a lot of you may know about the ISRC, which is basically the serial number for a sound recording. It's a unique number that attaches to a sound recording, and it's something the industry started 15 years ago or so. There wasn't a good place to go and figure out or no good lookup system for that information. So you have something that was created to try to help the money flow better, but there was no single place to go to get the data. We have made that available on our website. We have 40 million plus sound recordings with their ISRCs. It's free for anybody. You can go to the Sound Exchange website, and we're also helping to power the IFPI website, doing the same thing. So things like that are very important if the industry's gonna flow well, and if, like I said, if we want to remove friction and try to make everything work a little bit more smoothly. So data is a critical foundation of making sure it all works right, and it's not just about the money flow. Another thing about data in the digital economy, people want to know that data a lot more, especially with Alexa and sound-activated speakers. It's not unusual for people to dial up Alexa and say, hey, I want to know, every recording produced by this person, or I want to know every recording where this person played drums, or I really love the horn section, from Earth, Wind, and Fire. Where else did they play? That kind of thing. As people are starting to dive in more through experimenting, through these searches online, through voice-activated search, the metadata is very important to making that happen, because you can't do that if the data's not there.
Yeah, I would just say I think data touches every single part of the industry, not just royalty and accounting, and not just crediting artists for their work, both of which are very important. But on the last panel, they talked about everything from A&R to finding new audiences. So, somebody had to figure out that Lil Nas X was really popular on TikTok. It's not like Columbia Records, went and had auditions or went to a nightclub or something like that, right? So data is very important in A&R, but it's also incredibly important in finding an audience for your artist in ways that you never could before. From organizing their tour schedule by seeing, where they're catching on in different parts of the world, to figuring out how to maybe leverage data in artists who may have sounds that are somewhat similar or might appeal to the same audience, and trying to, do everything from pair them together to put them on the same stage, to, delving in to see where your, streams are taking off in an area where you never thought you would try to put your promotion or your marketing dollars. So data has touched every single corner of the industry, and I think what's going to be important going forward is how much control do the record companies and artists who own the data have over their data? Is their data just meant to benefit the digital services who have sort of the initial reads of some of it, or is it really to benefit them and their ability to sort of craft a career for that artist? And so there may be a few data debates going forward based on ownership, control, and use, because it's become that important.
Right. So Mike, you talked about Alexa, and it is actually not yet that popular in Asia, although I believe it's very, very popular in the US. So perhaps both of you can talk about some trends in relation to AI and those types of things, and what you see its impact on the music industry.
Yeah, AI is a fascinating concept, and it's obviously something that's impacting lots of industries. I think there's several areas where AI can sort of play in the music industry. One is obviously the algorithms that when you have a lot of services that try to feed you music that you like. And AI can only make that better. The more the algorithm and machine knows about not just what you listen to, the more it knows about you, it can feed you particular music. There are amazing correlations between not just age demographics, but people that buy this type of good tend to like this type of music, or people that vacation in this area tend to be this type of music consumer. So AI, I think, helps with the search engines. On the back end, I think AI can also help a lot with matching. When you try to match up data, when services report what they play, it's not. There are a lot of problems with it. There's very few services that are great at reporting exactly what's played. There's a lot of errors, a lot of gaps. I know we've started playing around with AI so we can do better matching on the back end and help get money out quicker. Even though we pay pretty quickly, 90% of our revenues are out the door in 45 days. But if we can speed that up, that would be even better. So those are two areas I think AI can help, the back end and on the front end.
And most of the real artificial intelligence has been things like voice-activated services where, they react to or have an interface with the consumer. But in the United States, one of the more sort of controversial policy issues that's come up is the use of artificial intelligence in the creation of music and what that means for artists and for record companies and for ownership. And you really have to look at three different areas. The first is machine learning, which is, any kind of process where the creation really isn't coming from the computer. It's really coming from a human, and the computer is sort of putting things together. So that's sort of in the world of production music and other types of commercial uses of music. Then you have what I would call artist-assisted music. This has been happening in electronic dance music for a long time, where artists will use machines and computers in order to help them make music, but it's really still the artist who is the genesis of it. And then the third, which is sort of the most controversial, is what happens when the machine actually makes the music by itself. And so the Copyright Office in the United States came out with sort of a new policy statement that said that there has to be a certain amount of human interaction, not just designing the program, in order to have copyright over a musical work or a sound recording or a performance. But that is a very tiny sliver. So it's taking up all of the oxygen in the room because it's sort of this, scary concept of what happens when humans don't make music anymore. But in actuality, people say AI and they mean that, but it is really tiny. Most of it has to do with artists on the production and creation side using machine learning to help them make their art.
And I should say that last point is maybe controversial, but it shouldn't be. Because, look, we're all about technology, both of us, the industry, everybody here. Technology has done amazing things for the industry. But to completely remove the creators from making music shouldn't be a question at all. Machines can't make music at the end of the day. There's got to be that human element. So I agree it's controversial among the lawyers, but it shouldn't be controversial in this room.
Well, everything's controversial among the lawyers.
Well, talking about controversy, one area in Asia is tariff setting. So perhaps, Mike, you could talk a bit about tariff setting in the United States.
Sure. So tariff setting in the U.S., tariffs are a controversial issue, even in this room. You have a lot of countries have compulsory licenses where basically, the record label or the performer have created this awesome piece of art, and the government gives it away at government rates. So that's good for some folks in the industry, and it has downsides for some folks in the industry. In the U.S., we have a compulsory system for basically radio-like services, non-interactive streaming. So Sirius XM satellite radio, webcasting. As Mitch said earlier, there's a full free market economy in the U.S. for interactive services. But for non-interactive, it's set by judges, a 3-judge panel in Washington. And as you can see, I think the compulsory license in the U.S. has helped the U.S. webcasting industry really explode. That's how we got to that $1 billion that you saw on the first slide. And an important thing, if you're going to have a compulsory system, it's got to reflect a free market, right? It's bad enough that the government forces you to give your stuff away. The least they can do is make sure you're paid at a fair market level, and that the judges who set these rates look to what the market is doing. And in the US, we've actually been pretty successful in doing that. There's a slide right here. Satellite radio, Sirius XM satellite radio is a very large service in the US. It's audio only, so audio streaming to about 35 or 38 million subscribers at $12 or $14 a month. Do the math. It's a lot of cash. And that operates under this tariff system that we have in the U.S., set by our tribunal. But as you can see, we've been, Sound Exchange, in conjunction with the U.S. industry, has been very successful in getting rates up. And it's a little hard to read, but basically we're up now at 15.5% of revenue. That's what we get for the music from Sirius XM. And you can see that big jump. A couple years ago was the new license, and we actually had an increase of 42% overnight. So on December 31st of one year, they were paying like 11.5%, and on the following Monday, that went up to 15 or 15.5. So as long as you have a tariff system that reflects the free market, it has a lot more benefits. It's still the case that it's a compulsory. It's still the case that for that in the U.S., for non-interactive streaming, an owner cannot withhold. But if done properly and done efficiently, and if you have an entity that is overseen by the industry to make sure it's run efficiently, it's worked okay.
I would also say a feature of the U.S. that's important is that you have an option to do a free market deal if you want to. So if you offer different types of services, if you offer an on-demand service and you offer a non-interactive service, it might be better and more efficient for you, since you have to do the free market for one part and the other parts in the compulsory license. You may want to cut a deal on the whole thing because it's easier to do that. You may want to have a global service where the compulsory license, is U.S. only, and that allows you to do that. And because we have that system, the judges can look at those real free market prices as a sort of guidepost for how they're going to set the non-interactive license, which then makes that compulsory license work so well because you're getting a real free market or fair market rate. If in India, for example, if they had a complete compulsory license with no free market barometer, right, it would depress all of the rates for all music, and people would be getting well under the free market. So I think that the combined system that we have in the U.S. sort of has levers that play off of each other, and that allows both to work pretty well.
Okay. Well, I see we have 1.5 minutes left. I think we could go on for much further. I wanted to thank both of you for flying in all the way from the U.S., but one last question. So what is your prediction for within the next 10 years? And if you were a betting person, where will the next big hit come from?
All right, so I think it's Latin America's turn for the next hit, so I'm just going to go there. And I'm going based on sort of the trajectory, at least in the U.S. market, of the explosion in Latin music. Asia and Latin America are the two areas where I think we're seeing the biggest explosion in the appeal of new artists to the U.S. market. And I think it's just the beginning. So I would say Asia and Latin America for that. In the next 10 years, I think we're going to see a lot of differentiation in services. You're already starting to see it where, in the US, if you want that Alexa service and you are in your living room and you say, hey, Alexa, play the Cars, since we just lost a great member of the Cars, Alexa will say, oh, I'm sorry, that's not available on your regular free bundle. would you like to pay $3.99 a month and you can get all the music you want just on this device? That's separate from what you're paying Spotify or what you're paying Amazon Unlimited. So different price points for different services. I think the car, as it evolves, is going to change the entire marketplace and offer differentiation of services for the car. So I would watch the car, and I would watch higher priced for higher quality and lower priced for niche services or supplemental services.
That was like 3 or 4 predictions.
Listen.
Okay, 10 years from now?
Yes.
I was going to go with the car, but not just differentiation. Eventually, we're going to have, so the dashboard is a huge and valuable piece of real estate for the music industry. Listening that happens as people are commuting to work and driving cross country or wherever is hugely valuable. I'm going to be very intrigued to see what happens when autonomous cars actually start to drive the roads and be pervasive, because when you have to drive and keep your eyes on the road, it's an audio-only service. If we actually move to full autonomous vehicles, I think there's going to be a switch to more audiovisual engagement. I hope that's good for the music industry. It could be a risk for the music industry because there are many other things besides music that are good for audiovisual. So autonomous cars, question mark. Smart speakers, though, and I know they haven't penetrated Asia as much as the US, they're going to explode because it's amazing what they bring. They make a whole house. You can just call out what you want, and it just plays. So I think smart speakers are going to explode. And we're going to see different... that's going to change the listening patterns, not just the way that I mentioned before. With streaming, there's a lot of older music out there. But think about, another thing about a smart speaker. You come home after a long week. You come in on Friday. You're tired. You pour yourself a scotch. And maybe you just dial up an emotion, right? Or maybe you call to your house to play you, a certain genre.
Scotch music.
Scotch music, So I think the way folks engage with a smart speaker is very different than how they engage with, an app on their phone. And they engage at different times, and they engage in more communal way, maybe, with a smart speaker. With, it's a bunch of people in the room rather than just on your phone. So I think those are 2 things to watch. And in terms of the next big hit, obviously, Mitch is not smart about his audience, and
It's just being honest.
No, I actually think I was going to say the same thing. Either Latin America or there's a lot of action in Asia and especially in India right now. So just for variety's sake, I'm going to go with India as the next big breakout surprise area.
Okay.
Because it's a huge up and coming market.
Okay, thank you. So let's give a warm applause to the speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you.